today we're going to travel farther back in time from the 16th century, predating the Plantagenets in England, to the legend of King Arthur. Then we will speed forward to the mid-20th century, first in the US, then in Spain and London, as we discuss the life of film star Ava Gardner. I'll be drawing her as Guinevere from the film The Knights of the Round Table. The film was made in England, where she met Queen Elizabeth II at the London premiere, where she later spent the last 3 decades of her life, along with her own corgis, at her residence near Hyde Park in Knightsbridge. Some of you may know I enjoy volunteering for the Ava Gardner Trust. I think you'll see why after this interview. Joining me today is the wonderful great-niece of Ava Gardner and trustee for the Ava Gardner Trust, Ava Thompson. Also with us is the amazing Lora Stocker, who has an encyclopedic knowledge of film history. She began volunteering as a social media specialist with the Ava Gardner Museum in 2019 and then joined the museum's board of directors. She currently serves as an honorary board member and volunteers as the museum's social media strategist. She's a professional artist, designer, and illustrator operating her own business, Lora Stocker Designs, in Johnston County, North Carolina. So hello, Ava and Lora. Thank you for joining us today for Holbein in History.
Hello. Hello. Thanks for having us. Looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. I'm excited too. And many are saying today that we are living in an age where celebrity is dead. I think a lot of this has to do with social media and seeing the real side of people, a bit like pulling back the curtain on Oz. Yet in this environment, Ava's star, I believe, continues to rise. And this was because Ava was an authentic, loyal, and kind human being who was way ahead of her time. So first, I'd like to ask you a question, Ava. What made your Aunt Ava special to you personally? And what can you tell us about the real Ava Gardner?
That is the subject of a whole book. And then read. I think that most people have had or currently have a person in their family or in their lives that is extra special among all others, a person that they regard as their person. And this is the way I see Aunt Ava, simply because she gave me so much time and attention through phone calls, cards, letters, gifts, clothes, jewelry, dolls, and visits. And I traveled with her son. I felt like she was the one who took a special interest in me. So therefore, she became my special person. She was also lots and lots of fun. She could turn the simplest things into little games. We did a lot of sightseeing in New York and in Los Angeles. I loved to go shopping with her. And as I grew older, she became a role model for me. I always remember her kindness and her compassion, generosity, and also her courage and independence. When I was a very little person, I actually thought she was mine because we never sat together.
I love that.
But later, I realized that she was just a special person the world over and not exclusively mine, but she still remained a special person in my life.
Yes, and that says so much about a person when they affect the life of a child. And the fact that you thought she was yours says so much about who she was as a human being. So you didn't first think of her as a star. You thought of her as the kind person in your life that took interest in you and your life. And it sounds like from everything I've read about Ava too, that was indicative of her, that she really focused on others. There was that quote from Frank Sinatra's ballet. He was talking about how she had every reason to be self-focused, but she was always focused outward, always asked him how he was doing. And I think that's a huge reason why she's still a star. really, as a human being, not just a star on the screen. And she opened the whole world to you. The other thing is she was truly ahead of her time, and she was progressive, even beginning as a child. She bucked segregation by sitting with her African-American friend Virginia in the theater, and considered both Virginia and her friend Shine like family, and they all worked together as equals on her family's farms. And then as an adult, she insisted that her assistant Renee be given entrance into clubs into LA, and she later co-chaired a charity event at the Waldorf to make theaters more accessible to communities of color. And you also talk on the Trust website, avagardner.com, about her membership with the NAACP in 1968. And she was really a champion of civil rights and racial equality throughout her life. And I also believe Ava is more relevant today than when she was a box office megastar, because she took her career and her life into her own hands. In fact, many say when Marlo Thomas created the show That Girl in 1966, about a girl who moves away from home to pursue her dreams in New York, that Marlo was inspired by the book The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. I find it interesting that Ava was seen with Friedan's book 3 years earlier in an airport, but even more fascinating, she was living her own life, the That Girl life, beginning a full 10 years earlier. This was at a time when a woman couldn't get a credit card, apartment, or a high-paying job without restrictions or even barriers, and when women took home half of what a man earned, when women held 22% of faculty positions in higher education, 9% of the jobs as scientists, 7% as physicians, and 3% as lawyers. And when there are no female governors, mayors, or cabinet members, nearly a decade before these statistics, we have that Ava moved to Spain in 1955, and she completely prefigured a movement that would change women's lives forever. So in my mind, she was the original That Girl, and she really was an example to you of that, and was also just a very kind person and opened up the world to you.
Yes, she told me once that she wanted me to take my education seriously, take it just as far as I wanted to, because she wanted me to be able to live my life exactly like I wanted to live it and make my own decisions. And although I am married and have 3 grown children, my husband and I are equal partners in our marriage, and I did not give up my independence to have a family. And I think that Ava was pleased about that. She knew my husband and she liked him very much, and was happy that he was progressive enough to let me have my independence.
Yes. And I think that's what Ava wanted too. She was looking for that as well, a partnership that was equal. And I think she would have liked a family as well. And I just love that she understood that. You should really tell us what you did for a living, because I think that says a lot about Ava too, what you decided to do, Ava.
Well, I actually wanted to be a lawyer, but my parents were not as progressive as Ava, and they just decided that they were not going to support that ambition. And so my next love was teaching, and I became a high school English teacher and spent some wonderful years in the classroom with teenagers, but wanted to go there, so got a master's degree in North Carolina principal certificate, and I was an assistant principal in 2 schools, and then I became a middle school principal, and from there, a high school principal. I ended my career as a district supervisor and was in charge of 5 high schools and 11 middle schools in the Johnson County school system. And my job was described to me as keeping problems off the superintendent's desk. But nevertheless, the interesting thing about this is that although Ava was well aware all the time of my career path, she always saw me as a teacher. And when she talked about me to someone else, what she said was, and she is a teacher. I think that came from her childhood, where she lived in a home that was called a teacherage, and Mama Gardner and Papa Gardner managed the teacherage. And the teachers, the single teachers who lived there, just showered her with attention and adored her and pleasantly spoiled her. Teaching became the ultimate profession for Ava. She honored the profession and was proud that I had become a teacher.
I think that says so much about her and her character. And speaking of her upbringing, so Lora, can you tell us a little about Ava's rise to stardom? I think it started with a trip to New York to visit her sister. And can you tell us a little about what it was like being a starlet in 1941 at MGM? Because it certainly wasn't glamorous.
That's an understatement for sure. You know, as we've all kind of alluded to, Ava had an upbringing very indicative of North Carolina. She came from a close-knit family that was very supportive and very loving. And it was a large family. So she had all of this wonderful kind of extension of additional parents and cousins and playmates and all of this wonderful environment to grow up in. When she did reach the point that she was finishing up high school and looking for what was next, she had an opportunity to go visit her older sister, Bappy, who was living in New York at the time, who was a trailblazer in her own right, setting the stage for one of the Gardner children blazing their own trail and pursuing their own happiness. And I think that that was a real example to Ava of living a large life, if you will.
Yeah.
And so she went to visit Bappy, and at the time, Bappy was married to a very successful photographer named Larry Targe. He and his family had a series of photography studios in the city, and he was a very gifted photographer. And he took a series of portraits of Ava by herself, but also with her sister Bappy. And there's some beautiful portraits that really capture the natural beauty that Ava had at that kind of teenage going into adulthood period of her life. And so one of these photos in particular is what we call today at the museum and in other contexts, quote unquote, discovery photo, because it was placed in the window. Torrin loved it so much that he placed it in the window of one of the studios. And a person affiliated with Lowe's, which was part of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer company, saw the picture and called up pretending to be a scout, but he really wanted to date with this beautiful young woman who was photographed in the window. And one thing led to another, and Larry and Bappy thought, well, Ava is beautiful. She should be in pictures. There might be an opportunity for her there. So they ended up making copies of the photograph and submitting it. And MGM saw the potential of this young woman and ended up calling her back up to New York to do a studio test. She was Southern, like myself, like Ava. Also, she had an accent somewhere in between the two of us, probably. And it was difficult for the New York gentleman filming the test to totally understand her. So she ended up filming the test in silence, but she was so dynamic in just her movement and her poise and her elegance that was already apparent. And she had magnetism that when the head of MGM Studios at the time, Louis B. Mayer, saw the footage, he said, well, let's get this young girl under contract. So one thing led to another, and she had actually graduated from high school, and she had enrolled in a secretarial program at Atlantic Christian College in Wilson, North Carolina, which is now called Barton College. And she was starting out that program and enjoying her time at school, was named a campus beauty in her yearbook. But ultimately, this opportunity was too great. So her mom agreed to let her go as long as she had a chaperone, and Bappy quickly raised her hand. And the two of them set off on this grand adventure from North Carolina to Hollywood, California. So they boarded the train, headed to Hollywood, and I won't say the rest is history, but it was certainly a very different life pretty much immediately. I won't go into all the details, but I'll just say that she quickly met her first husband, Mickey Rooney, and was swept off her feet. That's a story for a whole another episode of the show. But to just give some context, she went to Hollywood. She was 18 years old, almost 19, and she was sort of a fish out of water, as probably any one of us would have been at the time. Having come from this close, tight-knit family that was very involved with each other and very supportive, to being thrown into this factory setting, as they called it back in the day, of Hollywood, where MGM was one of the largest lots, and it was a factory. It had all kinds of departments. It had a wardrobe department, a department that just managed the weaponry in films, carpentry department, multiple sound stages, and a whole kind of system in place to pluck people from relative obscurity and turn them into box office stars. And that's the context in which Ava found herself, where she was really someone who did like education and valued that. She was certainly given quite the education. They took all the assets that were already there, her poise, her personality, her grace, and her natural sense of herself, and built on that. Now, they did try to change her some, as MGM did often. They tried to turn her into their idea of a starlet and put her in MGM-style makeup, MGM-style hair, and that was hit or miss, the success of that. Now, I'll explain that in a second, but, she was taught movement classes, dialect classes. She was given all of these opportunities to refine herself in a way that would appeal to the masses.
Yes.
Again, building off of all the wonderful attributes she had naturally. But that being said, it was a competitive environment. Every day, a new starlet or a new potential leading man was arriving to the set, and maybe more than one of them at a time. And so it was a competitive environment, but it was also one where she quickly made friends. And like I said a minute ago, she met her first husband on her second day in Hollywood. She also met people that would be part of her lives for the rest of her lives, which was wonderful. She fairly early on met Lana Turner, who became a great friend. She met Lena Horne, who was a dear friend. A lot of other people that in their later years spoke very highly of her and were very supportive of her. And so in that environment, she had the opportunity to not star in films per se, but to do basically what was kind of part of the training ground, which was a series of bit roles, often uncredited, often a cigarette girl, someone at a lunch queue, or someone, a waitress, or somebody passing in a car, or somebody in a crowd scene, or a group of youthful teenagers at a dance party, and those kinds of roles. And she did, in her mind, and looking back on her career, probably feel like she languished in that for a while. Yeah. In each studio at the time had their own identity. You had Universal, that was known for their monster pictures. You had Warner Brothers, known for gangster films. You had MGM, that was really considered the Rolls Royce of the studios, and it was glamour and class and technology and all of these things. That was their spot. And ultimately musicals were their big bread and butter. But the studio didn't always know how to position her and how best to take advantage of what she could bring to the world of film. And that was often the case with a lot of stars, where they ended up getting their big break by doing what was called a loan out, which is when a studio would have you under contract, but another studio wanted to use a particular actor or actress for a film. So then they would reach out to the studio and say, we'll pay you X amount of dollars, often far more than the star was making, if you would loan us out this actor or this actress. And that happened through the entire studio system. But that was actually what gave Ava the opportunity to show what she could do. So 1946, so 5 years after being in Hollywood, she was loaned out for 2 films that year, the first of which was a low-budget or B-picture film noir called Whistle Stop. And then that film actually led to her big, big break, which the production team behind the film The Killers, which was an adaptation of an Ernest Hemingway short story, were looking for somebody to fill the role of what is now considered one of the ultimate film fatales, Kitty Kelly. So she was so well received in Whistle Stop that the production team of The Killers saw her in that and thought she's perfect. So they reached out to MGM again and got her for that role. And what they did that was really helpful to Ava and her screen persona was they let her be Ava. They let her be natural. They let her wear her hair in a way that Ava herself wore her hair. They let her makeup be a lot more subtle and natural. They let her costuming, although she's well known for having this beautiful black dress in the film that is stunning on her, the rest of the film, she's wearing a trench coat in a series of scenes. She's also wearing just a little sweater and a skirt. And she's able to really show the naturalistic characteristics of her acting that would define her screen persona in the years ahead. And with that film, the skies were the limit. It was a huge box office hit. And at that point, MGM went, wait a minute, we've really got something here that we've underutilized.
Yeah.
And that set the path for her huge successes that would come later in the 40s and primarily in the early to mid 50s.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head too, where she had such natural screen presence. And like you said, even going back to her testing films, she's not even speaking, but they're glorious because of the way she moves, her poise, and like you said, her magnetism. And it's just so interesting that you use the phrase, and it's so perfect, the loan out. Which studio did the killing?
Oh, it was Universal Studios.
Yeah, so Universal, I love how you said they let her be Ava.
Mhm.
It was like she's just a natural.
Mhm.
And I think you told me this when I've been to the Ava Gardner festivals, which I highly recommend, the first weekend in October. But it was one of the first women to wear a trench coat on a film, right?
If not the first, very, very early.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that really, again, kind of her whole look in that film started setting fashion trends. And that's something that Ava continued to do throughout her entire career, both in front of the camera, but also in studio portraiture or in her own personal fashion choices at premieres and other events. She really is someone who continues to this day to influence any runway fashion show you see each year. You'll find one or two looks, if not more, that directly go back to Ava's sense of style and fashion.
Yes, 100%. So, in her filmography, Lora, what led Ava to go to Spain? And then, Ava, maybe you can tell us why she stayed.
Well, Ava's first real experience of going abroad came in 1950. At this point, she had become a fairly well-established star, still a star on the rise, I would say. She had not achieved the international fame that would hit for her in the 50s. The 50s was really her golden age of film and working, although she continued to have a very successful career until really the end of her life. And I personally love a lot of the work that she did in the 60s and 70s, very interesting roles. But the 50s was really kind of her box office peak when she became this world-renowned star. So in 1950, she was cast, again, it was a low now in the sense that it was a film that was made outside the confines of Hollywood, but it was in partnership with MGM. So it was distributed by MGM. They were involved with it, but they weren't the driving force behind the film. And it's a very innovative picture. In fact, it's probably my favorite of all of her roles and all of her films. It's called Pandora and the Flying Dutchman. It was shot in 1950, released in 51. And that film was really a turning point in her life, not just the role and the opportunity and the way that it stretched and expanded her concept of how to approach a character and how she could use her natural gifts to tell a story, but also it got her out of the U.S.
Yeah.
And not that she didn't love her home country, she certainly loved her home state of North Carolina, and that was always something she was very deeply tied to. But Hollywood was a difficult place, and it was probably more so today because of, as you said earlier, social media, internet, and the proliferation of popular culture and celebrity. But at that time, Ava was a private person in a lot of ways. She was a very public, very private person, if you will.
Yeah.
And paparazzi and the scrutiny and the invasive management that you could find in the studio system, all of those things were not conducive to the free spirit that Ava was. And getting out of the confines of that environment in the studio and the system and the press and all those things and getting to Europe was probably like just a huge anvil being lifted off her shoulders, I think. And in making Pandora, it was, again, a film that was very innovative and very unique, and I highly recommend everyone check it out if they haven't seen it. But she was able to go to the two countries that would be these great loves of her life in the latter part of the second half of her life. She first went over to London to do some work around wardrobe fitting and some work on the sets and that kind of thing. And then she went to Spain, where she filmed the majority of the movie. And again, those two countries just opened up her eyes to what it could be like to live without the confines and the stresses and the structures of being in LA and Hollywood.
Yes. And with Pandora, Lora, we're both artists, and there's such an influence from Man Ray. Can you tell us about the painting a little bit?
Well, yeah, I can tell you a little bit about that. So the film was filmed by I would call him a visionary filmmaker. I wish he was someone that had had more opportunities to do more work. But it was written and directed by a filmmaker named Albert Lewin, who had worked in the industry for a number of years. He was highly literate, highly artistic, and he ran within a circle of like-minded individuals. in these cultural centers of the world, in New York and in LA, London, Paris, all of these places. And he was great friends with the surrealist artist Man Ray. And so when he was putting together this production of Pandora and the Flying Dutchman, which again, just the concept of the film itself is really fascinating. It's kind of combining multiple legends and myth, and then setting them in the context of a group of people who are in that world themselves. Archaeologists, explorers, artists, singers in this remote little sea village in Spain. So Albert Lewin was looking for opportunities to inject into the film some of the philosophies around surrealistic practices, both in art, in visuals, in literature, because this film itself has a lot of surrealistic elements in how it's shot and how it's structured, how it concludes. So Man Ray was a great fit, and they were great friends. So he sent Ava to meet with Man Ray, and the original intent was that there is a painting within the film that is a rather significant plot device. And I won't say more than that because I don't want to give it away. But Ava sat for Man Ray, and Man Ray was immediately smitten, just as Albert Lewin was with Ava, with her presence, with her personality, with her beauty. And she quickly was on the verge of being a great muse of his in putting this portrait together. And you can see photographs of what the portrait looked like that he created. Unfortunately, when Albert Lewin received it, he wasn't pleased. It didn't quite achieve what he had in mind for the film. So he got another artist to create the two portraits that are seen in the movie. Although that didn't take away from their friendship, they stayed good friends. And Man Ray did create a really unique chess set, was later sold, mass produced in some form or fashion. I don't know how many were produced, but there are other versions of it.
Oh, wow.
But a chess set that is seen in the film, and the visual of a chessboard is repeated throughout the narrative.
Yeah.
In some flashback scenes in the film. So that's the finished piece that Man Ray actually created for the movie. But the whole film has a tone and sensibility that fits very closely the work of Man Ray and his contemporary.
Yeah, and I really love that about it. And it's kind of mystical, just like Man Ray's paintings, bringing the old ideas into the new and these interesting landscapes. I love that about it. And also, even the flamenco in the film, having taken flamenco for over 2 decades now. It's interesting because it's true flamenco. It's what we call La Verdad, which is interesting because usually in films they do very touristy flamenco, but not in Pandora and the Flying Dutchman. And I don't know if many people know this, but Ava was very interested in flamenco and took it in Spain. And that leads us to Ava Thompson. Why do you think she stayed in Spain? And also, I feel like Ava opened up the world to you and all the traveling you did. So maybe you can tell us about that.
I would like to piggyback on something that Lora said. Lora talked about how Ava valued her privacy, and that was certainly a part of the reason that she moved to Spain, was to get away from the paparazzi, which oftentimes can be very unkind. She also commented that at that point in her life, she needed some distance from Frank, and she had just finished filming Rebecca and decided to go for a vacation in Spain. She ended up at the Fiesta in Seville and just absolutely fell in love with the Spanish culture. She fell in love with flamenco, as you pointed out. She learned to do the authentic flamenco from the Andalusian gypsies,
which is amazing.
She had a car, several, as a matter of fact, and she would jump into her car. She would go exploring, meeting peasants, if you will, and spending time with them. And one of the things that attracted her much to life outside the cities, among the real people of Spain, was their sense of family. The peasants found in the villages had a great sense of family and lived in close groups, and Ava really enjoyed that. She loved the color and ceremony and rituals of the Spanish people that truly appealed to her. And in addition to that, her circle of friends were in Spain and enjoyed the Spanish culture as well. She had a romance with Luis Miguel Dominguez, and he introduced her to Ernest Hemingway. So she was a part of that whole, and that kept her in Spain for nearly a decade, where she traveled and absorbing the culture and really enjoyed that decade of her life. And then after about a decade, she started to think about a more sedate life and looking around at what her options might be. And she found that she was looking towards London, but a precipitating event actually led her to London was the Franco regime. She had moved from a residence that she owned outside of Madrid into Madrid because she was just closer to everything there. And in the building where she lived, the exiled dictator Argentina also had a residence, and he would step out onto his balcony and give speeches as if he were still in Argentina, talking to people of Argentina. And as a matter of fact, he did go back and so again as the Argentine president. But Ava just thought that was ridiculous. She would step out onto her balcony and she would well, Peron and Franco were friends. In some respects, they shared political ideologies. And Franco didn't like the fact Ava was giving Peron a hard time. So he retaliated by sending her a great big bill for back taxes. And she owed no back taxes. Her business manager in Los Angeles always took care of her tax bills. She really did not owe any taxes, but her business manager flew to Madrid and they made a settlement. And that was the precipitating event set to Ava Kids to leave. And so then she went to London and actually for a while lived in the residence of Robert Ruark, Carolina, or a writer, a famous writer of that area that was born in North Carolina. When he passed away, his wife moved to New York. Ava took his residence until she could find her permanent residence in Knightsbridge. But she spent the rest of her life in London, and she enjoyed all of the things that surrounded her, like the Royal Albert Theatre. She had a wonderful group of friends there and lived a very content and peaceful life in London.
That's just wonderful. I love that. And when, Lora, did she film the Knights of the Round Table? Wasn't that before she moved to London? You can tell us best.
So the film was released in 53, so she would have done most of the filming in 52, 53.
Okay, so before. Then, what can you tell us about the Knights of the Round Table?
Well, it's an interesting film in her filmography because we were talking briefly about Pandora from 1951, which was a leading role. She had another huge success in 51 with the musical Showboat, where she was co-lead in the film, and then more films where she was the lead or co-lead. And then really coming off of the huge success that was Mogambo, in which she was nominated for Best Actress at the Academy Awards and received some of her best reviews of her entire career, she was kind of randomly cast in this film, Knights of the Round Table. I mean, it is a beautiful film. The setting, the costumes, the creation of the film itself is really impressive and beautiful. It is really at the moment at which the film industry is competing with television. So television came out in the early 50s and quickly took hold of certainly the American audiences, if not the world, and became a huge competitive arm against film. The movie-going experience, an experience that most people went to the movies at least once a week, if not multiple times a week, before the advent of television or the mass acceptance of television. And so the film industry was looking for all sorts of ways to compete and to offer something that was really going to draw people in. So for one, you had color films, of course, which was something that television didn't offer at the time, at least not on the mass scale that it does now. But you also had the rise of what is deemed the film epic. Now, there had certainly been epic films before that, but The Knights of the Round Table, it's actually considered part of the unofficial trilogy, with the film that predated it in 1952 called Ivanhoe, and The Knights of the Round Table in 1953, and then a third film in 1955, The Adventures of Quentin Durward, all starring Robert Taylor in different mythological epic character roles, big costume dramas that filled the screen. And Ivanhoe was a big success, and so all three were MGM productions done by the same group of creative talent behind the screen, particularly produced by Kendra S. Berman. But Knights of the Round Table is interesting because it was the first film that MGM shot and released in what was called CinemaScope. And CinemaScope was an early version of widescreen production. So it was, again, that larger-than-life splendor. And it was pulling from a story that most people were familiar with that had resonance, certainly abroad, with the European markets. These great quests and stories of the Holy Grail and all of those Knights of the Round Table stories, and Guinevere and Camelot, which would find later success on Broadway with the show Camelot in the 1960s. So it's a story that has been adapted many, many times. But Knights of the Round Table, again, Ava was at a point where she really had become a box office draw. She was a lead actress. If not a lead, she was in a very prominent secondary role that was borderline the lead, like Showboat, for example. And this was a very small part in a very big film. And you look at some of the poster art or some of the ways the film was marketed, and you think that her character, which of course she played Guinevere, was in every other scene of the movie. But she actually doesn't appear until about 25 to 30 minutes into the film. And it's a movie worth seeing. It's got a lot of addictive qualities, I think, but I feel she's greatly underutilized.
Yeah.
And I think that she felt in the production that she felt that it was not that it wasn't up to her stature at the time, but it was just not a challenging role for her.
Right.
It was, she didn't particularly care for these kind of costume dramas, although I will argue that she's gorgeous.
Yeah. It's like, we want to see you in the costumes.
I know. I love how she looks in these films, and especially this film, the costumes are quite lovely. It wasn't a meaty role for her, and she had reached a point where she always took her career seriously. She always was prepared for her roles and put a lot of thought and concern into how she developed a character, because she was a star, an actress that learned on her own, really.
Yes.
Learned in the trenches. And really, again, we talked about her being very naturalistic. That was the hallmark of her screen persona. And this is a film that, is set at a different time and in not a different tongue exactly, but a different way of speaking and presenting herself.
Yeah.
That not that she bucked against, but it was just not, visually she's great in the film. But you could tell that when you read her few comments that she made about the film, she was disappointed with it, and she was disappointed with the role. But again, well worth checking out, well worth seeing, because it's shot in CinemaScope, it's in Eastman color, so the film is very vibrant. And it just seems that the director cared more about showing the scope of the landscape and everybody on horseback and all the fancy planking costumes, than the character development per se. And certainly the opportunity. Ava responded very well to directors that would work with her and kind of participate in the development of the character with her. Right. And Richard Thorpe, who, was a competent director, most known for doing a lot of the Tarzan pictures. That was kind of his claim to fame. But he seemed more interested in the action adventure part than character development or nurturing the romantic concepts of the film that are really what attract a lot of us to the story to begin with.
Right.
So I know that's a long way of giving a little bit of critique of the film.
No, but that's good.
But, that gives you kind of the context. And again, after this film, then her next film was The Barefoot Contessa, where she also received wonderful reviews. And then following that was Milwaukee Junction, where she got a BAFTA nomination. Yeah. So this is, it almost feels like this film should have come out earlier in her filmography when she was on the rise, as opposed to when she was at this peak period. But, 53 was a very busy year in terms of film releases for her, because she made a very delightful but small cameo in the successful musical The Bandwagon. She also starred in Ride the Carry that year, and of course Mogambo, as I mentioned, and then there's this film. Knights of the Round Table.
Holy cow.
Again, it was a huge success, and it is well placed within the rise and popularity of the epic film. And it was a big success in the States and abroad for MGM. So, not to throw it under the bus, I
Sure.
wish it had been given more to do because there's a lot of untapped potential in her character, I think.
Well, it makes me think, Laura, of where we are now, where movies are competing with streaming. And so we have these big, epic superheroes to counteract. It's interesting, we're kind of in the same place.
And you have so many noted actors going into television where they can do these kind of 8 to 10 episode short, almost mini films where they can really expand and explore a character and develop a character. So, yeah, it is interesting.
Coming off something like Mogambo, like you said, and then going into Knights of the Round Table was such a complete shift. And Showboat, I always feel like, and again, I'm going to ask Ava this, but I always feel like when I'm watching Mogambo, I feel like I'm with Ava, the real Ava. But I know, Ava Thompson, you have a film that you feel best shows the real Ava. But before you tell us about that, one thing I want to point out is the fact that the gypsies in Spain adopted Ava so quickly and embraced her is such a litmus test for her authenticity as a person. Because the gypsies in Spain wouldn't care less if you're a big star. They don't care. They're very to themselves and their art form, they gatekeep it a bit. And so the way that I read that she was so embraced by the gypsy community and the flamencos, I'm like, yes, that makes perfect sense that they fell in love with her because she's an authentic person and that's what they gravitate to. So if there's ever any question, that's the litmus test. She passed.
Good observation. But going back to Knights of the Round Table for just a moment, another aspect of this, coming off of Mogambo, Ava was advised to stay in Europe for a while longer so she could take advantage of the tax break. And while she enjoyed making another movie with Robert Taylor, she commented that she was very uninspired by the role, that she felt out of place. And I think that Laura's commentary on the movie certainly supports Ava's comments about the movie. Personally, I think the best thing that came out of that period was the Norman Parkinson photograph, one of which now appears, the Ava Gardner Coffee Breakfast at Dominique's. That whole series of photographs is just gorgeous.
And they look like they could have been shot yesterday, don't they?
Yes.
That's what's so amazing about Ava.
Yes.
So many of those photo shoots and behind the scenes, I mean, they look, again, she looks like she's just timeless.
Yes.
In her, in her presence, in her appearance. It's amazing.
Yes. 100%.
And backing up just a little bit further, Laura was talking about Man Ray and the special little relationship that developed between Man Ray and Ava. In addition to that, the photograph that was on the table on the yard was Ava's all-time favorite photograph and the only photograph that was displayed in her London residence on Knightsbridge. And there are several poses of that. Her favorite one is where she is looking to her left and not when she is looking directly into the camera.
And that was taken by Man Ray. And I thank you for mentioning that, Ava. I'm sorry I missed that. But yes, it's a beautiful photograph.
It really was a beautiful photograph and Ava's favorite. But I think that the Norman Parkinson photographs were certainly a very good thing to come out of that time period. The decade of the 50s, during that decade, Ava was, if not the most photographed woman in the world, she was certainly one of the most photographed women in the world. And for her to narrow down all those thousands of photographs into one photograph is amazing to me. She actually wanted that photograph on the cover of her autobiography, but by the time the book was published, she had left this good earth and did not really get a say in the photograph, and it was The Killers, which I think is good, but if we ever have an opportunity to revise her autobiography, I'm going to try to get her favorite photo on the cover. And to your question, the film that they shows the truest picture of Ava is probably Night at the Iguana. I think she certainly enjoyed that role. She got excellent reviews for it. It was her first time working with Richard Burton, and she enjoyed that. Came to Florida Hill as a brother, and of course she enjoyed being in the company of Elizabeth. She had known from the early days at MGM, and they were able to build on a great relationship really that already existed. It was under the direction of her favorite director, John Huston. She was in a very romantic location that she enjoyed. Everything about making that film helped Ava to relax and really settle into her role. And even her acting in that role reverted to the more natural acting of Eastern North Carolina. She was sassy in the film, and Ava was certainly sassy. The character just suited her very well. So it's hard to pick a favorite film. There were so many that appealed to me in so many ways, but if I had to pick one that most accurately represented who Ava really was, it would be Night at the Iguana.
I love that. And it gives us a window to her. And I want to read that quote from George Jacobs, who worked for Frank Sinatra. He said, "I could now see exactly why Mr. Sinatra was so obsessed with her. Super gorgeous women weren't like this one. The other film goddesses were narcissists, neurotic, concerned about no one except themselves. Ava was only concerned about others. Moreover, she had that magic that made those others feel that, with her in their corner, anything on earth was possible. She was a cross between Miss Universe, a girl next door, and a fairy godmother who could give you your dearest wish. The only problem was, once you met her, your dearest wish was her."
It was really interesting to me to watch Ava work the room, so to speak, because as she went from person to person, it was never about her. She managed to turn the conversation back to the person with whom she was speaking by asking them questions about how they were and, how is your family? And she would always turn the conversation back to the person that she was interacting with and away from herself and make that person feel most appreciated.
Oh, that's perfect. That says everything.
And I say that is a trait, Ava, you carry as well.
Yes, yes, yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, I have to say, when I'm working on things for Anne Boleyn, I really enjoy it and it's exciting and fun. But when I'm working with you all on Ava, I feel like I'm home. And you guys make me feel at home. And you remind me so much of my family. And so, yeah, I definitely sense that with you, Ava, as well. Well, thank you both. And is there anything I missed that you want to talk about, Lora?
Well, I think both Ava and I could, with you, we could talk about Ava Gardner all day. So,
Hit the high points.
Yeah, I would just encourage everyone to please check out the Trust website. There's so much wonderful content there, and follow the Trust on social media, and also, connect with the Ava Gardner Museum, because there's all kinds of great programming and content on their website and social media. So there's a wonderful array of places to learn more about the real Ava Gardner, which is what the Trust and the museum both set out to do, to tell those stories. And connecting with us online is a great way to further the conversation, ask questions, or just get to know this person that, I never had the opportunity to meet Ava, but I certainly feel like, and I'm sure you're the same, you feel like you know her.
Yeah.
Through her writing, through her work, through the legacy that she's left behind, and all the wonderful work that the Trust does to continue that legacy. She was just a beautiful person inside and out. I wish I could have met her, but I'm so glad I know her in the way that I do. And I'm just thankful for all the wonderful friendships and opportunities being involved with her story has helped me make, including with you both. So thank you so much for having me today. I've really enjoyed the conversation and look forward to our next one.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Lora. Thank you, Ava.
I want to thank you, Rebecca, for all the wonderful volunteer work that you do on behalf of Ava through the Ava Gardner Trust and through the Ava Gardner Museum. You are just a wonderful friend, and we all appreciate you very much.
Oh, well, thank you, Ava. I tell you, Ava Gardner's easy to love. Well, thank you so much, both of you, and have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.